all had a chance to reflect on and deepen our understanding of what reparations needs to be, why it is a significant and legitimate concern, and what we can all do about it, as opposed to all the different ways that we can wait to see what somebody else is going to do about it. So I kind of put together a PowerPoint presentation just so there would be some notes that would be available to people later as a reminder. You wouldn't have to scribble notes so actively. But everybody here should know that the United States has a long and ugly history of land theft, murder, rape, pillage, enslavement that have led to the founding of this nation and its development. Those things led to the piling up of a pile of resources that stand before us and attract people from all over the world, because when you are around that much capital, you are able to manipulate it, sometimes if you're lucky, or quite frankly, very often be manipulated by it. But for a lot of people, access to that capital is thought of as an opportunity to develop. So I want to talk about that as it relates to the cooperative movement that I think all of us are dedicated to. So we're going to go back a little through some history first, and then go from there to some definitions of some terms, and get some sense of the depth and the significance of this topic that we're talking about. So in 1865, and I can tell you the date of it, it was January 12th, 1865, after William Tecumseh Sherman had made its famous march through Atlanta, from Atlanta to the coast, the scorched earth policy, very violent, vicious form of warfare intended to make sure that the civilian population lost its taste for the war. The Army proceeded without any provisions of its own, living off of the land, which is to say that as it passed through places, it was confiscating food, confiscating animals, burning some things in order to try to win a war. And you got to understand that the Civil War, the outcome of the Civil War, wasn't completely determined by the fact that America is this great, big, powerful country, and the South is a backwater area that couldn't possibly stand up to it. There were all kinds of possibilities of alliances between the South and France and England, where some of the ruling classes there loved the South for the fact that it could produce some very cheap raw materials that could be used in their manufacturing and their development. But in any case, Sherman's march through the sea was somewhat successful and ended up freeing a whole lot of the people who were on plantations, who were still being held on plantations. And it was a kind of manifestation of the thing that Lincoln had put into the Declaration of Independence in 1863, which said that for military necessity, it was important that the slaves be free. That's because, again, the North was worried it wasn't going to win this war. And there were many, many racist sentiments that still existed in the North about the inferiority of Black folk. And that many people were not trying to do away with the institution of slavery, but they could not preserve the Union except by doing away with slavery. The South was certainly fighting to maintain slavery. The North wasn't fighting to end it as much as it was to restrict its extension. But in the course of it, couldn't win without the active participation of those enslaved people. And that happened as people were marching through, and some of them left behind the ranks. But anyhow, there was a meeting that was held, a very important meeting. William Tecumseh Sherman, big top general of the Northern Union Army, and Secretary Stanton, who was the Secretary of War, ended up meeting with 20 ministers and asked this question that I've heard so many times. It's like, what do you people want? But they asked it in the following form. It was like, what do you understand to be the nature of slavery? And what do you understand to be the nature of the independence granted by the Emancipation Proclamation? And how would you best take care of yourselves if you became independent? And I want to read to you from the answer. There was some military attaché who got assigned to take notes, and those notes were later published about a month later in the New York newspaper. And so we have a reasonable record of what took place at that meeting. So the first question was, first state what your understanding is in regard to the acts of Congress and the President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation touching the condition of the colored people in the rebel states. And the answer was, so far as I understand President Lincoln's proclamation, it is that if they would lay down their arms and submit to the laws of the United States before the 1st of January, 1863, all should be well, but if they did not, then all the slaves in the rebel states should be freed henceforth and forever. That's what I understood. And the second question, state what you understand by slavery and the freedom that was given by the President's proclamation. The answer that this minister gave, representing our whole community, was, slavery is receiving by irresistible power the work of another person, the work of another man, and not by his consent. The freedom, as I understand it, promises by the proclamation, is taking us from under the yoke of bondage and placing us where we could reap the benefit of our own labor, take care of ourselves, and assist the government in maintaining our freedom. The third question was, state in what manner you think you can take care of yourselves and how you can best assist the government in maintaining your freedom. The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and turn it and till it by our own labor, that is, by the labor of the women and children and old men, and we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare. And to assist the government, the young men should enlist in the services of the government and serve in such a manner as they may be wanted. The last question in this section was, state in what manner you would rather live, whether scattered among whites or in colonies by yourselves. And the answer was, I would prefer to live by ourselves, for there is a prejudice against us in the South that will take years to get over. But I do not know that I can answer for everybody else. And they surveyed the other 19 ministers in the room who were not speaking, and each one of them said the same thing, that they would rather go off by themselves and develop a community where, again, they would have access to land, be able to be productive for themselves, maintain the surplus to continue to develop their community. Everybody agreed with that except one, and that was the one who had never been enslaved, who was living in Baltimore at the time. I use that as an example to talk about what is it that people understood slavery to be and what is it that they wanted as a result of ending it. And they understood it would, when somebody took the product of your labor, and I think some of us would recognize that this still goes on. And they understood the freedom was when people have access to the product of their own labor and could protect and defend themselves. And this is the desire, and this is deeply rooted in the desire of the cooperative movement, that as we build worker co-ops, it's so that working people have access to the product of their own labor. But how this is related to reparations is, like, what does it take to repair the damage that was caused by a system of hundreds of years of enslavement? I want to read again briefly from a moderate who wrote a little earlier than this, before there was this war to preserve the Union and ultimately resulted in ending slavery. This moderate was Henry Clay from Kentucky. And I want to make sure that you understand he's a moderate. So these things that he said, as ugly as they may be, were out of the mouth of a moderate. The much more conservative and reactionary and backward idiots lived during that time and spoke their own ugliness as well. But this is what a moderate said. This was a moderate explaining why he thought abolition was a bad idea. He said the total number of slaves in the United States, according to the last enumeration of the population, was a little upwards of 2 million. Assuming their increase at ratio, and again, I'm sure he knew as well as we do now today that people were actively breeding slaves to sell into the Deep South based on the fact that the African slave trade had been made illegal in 1808. So there was active, particularly in the border areas of Maryland, Virginia, somewhat Kentucky, they were actively breeding, and their big product was slave bodies to sell into the South. But he said, assuming their increased ratio, which it probably is, of 5% per annum, then the present number would be 3 million. The average value of slaves at this time is stated by persons well informed to be as high as $500 each. To be certain, within the mark, let's suppose that it's only $400. The total value then, by that estimate, of the slave property in the United States is $1,200 million. Now this is $1839. Back then, $1.2 billion was a whole lot of money. In fact, the property represented by enslaved people exceeded the value of the property of all of the fixed manufacturing property, all the railroads in the United States. It was the largest category of property that existed. So when you hear people talking about property rights, remember that its roots lay deeply into the property in human beings that was enshrined in the Constitution. So he said this property, listen to this is so important. This property is diffused throughout all classes and conditions of society. It is owned by widows and orphans, by the aged and infirm, as well as the sound and vigorous. It is the subject of mortgages, deeds of trust, and family settlements. It has been made the basis of numerous debts contracted upon its faith, and is the sole reliance in many instances of creditors within and without the slave states for the payment of the debts due to them. And now he says, it is rashly proposed by a single fiat of legislation to annihilate this immense amount of property, to annihilate it without indemnity and without compensation to the owners of the property. Does any considerate man believe it to be possible to effect such an object without convulsion, revolution, and bloodshed? And so he described what was to come a few years later as the Civil War. But he goes on, and this is so important, again, get some sense of how deeply this is enshrined in the law and the fabric of the society. He said, I know that there's a visionary dogma, he calls it, that holds that Negro slaves cannot be the subject of property. I shall not dwell long on this speculative abstraction. That is property which the law declares to be property. I want to repeat that. What's property is what the law says is property. All this moral stuff you're saying about people can't be property, forget that. That is property which the law declares to be property. 200 years of legislation have sanctioned and sanctified Negro slaves as property. Under all the forms of government which have existed upon this continent during that long space of time, under the British government, under the colonial government, under all of the state constitutions and governments, under the federal government itself, and they have been deliberately and solemnly recognized as the legitimate subjects of property. In other words, he makes it clear that the government has fully backed this idea under each of its iterations that existed. So this isn't just the whim of some evil people living in the South. This isn't just somebody who, by force of arms, was able to take somebody one day and make them work for them. This was something that was deeply enshrined in the very fabric of the society as it was built. But not only that, it had been previously enshrined in every previous iteration of it and every subdivision of it. That is property which the law says is property. So when we talk about reparations and its relationship to the government and to the country, when we talked about the existence of systemic racism, this was a moderate's description of what that system was like and how pervasive it was. In case somebody, again, thinks that some of this is, that there were a few evil people that did bad things. No doubt there were. To the wild speculation of theorists and innovators stands opposed to the fact that in an uninterrupted period of 200 years duration, under every form of human legislation and by all departments of human government, African Negro slaves have been held and have been descended and have been transferred as lawful and indisputable property, they were treated as property by the very British example, which triumphantly appealed is worth our imitation, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so the point I'm making by that is that there was a system that existed for hundreds of years in which people were degraded, humans, were degraded and treated as property, treated worse than animals. Animals don't revolt, so you don't torture them to prevent them from doing it. Yeah, this was a very severe, long-standing practice that was coming to an end. So when we talk about reparation, we're talking about repair. We're talking about repair of the damage, but we're also talking about reclaiming the benefits, because as you heard his description of where the wealth of properties of enslavement was distributed throughout the society, you heard him going pretty deep into like, oh, this is something that everybody's got a little piece of, except those of us who were the subject of this, who were the object of that system. So that's kind of what slavery was. It ended in a way that a lot of people don't really understand by the active participation of the enslaved. And on the one hand, a general strike. There's a chapter in W.E.B. Du Bois' book, Black Reconstruction, that if you don't read the whole book, start out, you don't have to read it from, it's 600-700 pages. So a lot of people are not gonna read it from beginning to end. But jump to the chapter on the general strike and read, and then another chapter called The Coming of the Lord, from the Psalm, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." He uses this to talk about the entry of Black people into the war, and the general strike. He talks about the withholding of Black labor from the Confederacy as a decisive part of what was militarily required in order to win. So do not ever believe this this lie that has been told that Black people didn't participate in their own fight for independence. Not only did we participate, we were crucial to it. We were essential. We were the key. Had it not been for our participation in it, the South would have seceded, slavery would have continued to exist, and we wouldn't know as much as we do about Hitler, because it would have been very common in the United States, a system just as vicious. Okay, I'm part of an organization called NCOBRA. In fact, I've got on my NCOBRA sweatshirt from our 30th annual convention. That's the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. It's been around for a while, advocating for taking seriously, studying, and implementing reparations at a governmental level. But its program is deeper than that. I'm going to read briefly from its description of, it's on one of the slides. I mean, you might want to show that slide, the NCOBRA slide. Or maybe they don't have the slides, who knows? But if you had,
don't have the slides. And we don't have the slides, sorry about that.
Oh, okay. Woodley made me send her the slides, and I thought you were able to, I thought they were available. Anyway, so they have written this, that reparations is a process of repairing, healing, and restoring a people injured because of their group identity and in violation of their fundamental human rights by governments, corporations, institutions, and families. Those groups that have been injured have the right to obtain from the government, corporation, institution, or family responsible for the injuries that which they need to repair and heal themselves. In addition to being a demand for justice, it is a principle of international human rights law. Going on, the International Law Commission and the basic principles and guidelines for the rights to a remedy and reparation for victims of gross violations of international human rights and serious violations of international humanitarian law, both spells out what it is considered full reparations, understanding that full reparations must wipe out all consequences of the crime and abuse. Full reparations has 5 major components: cessation, restitution, compensation, satisfaction, and rehabilitation. it's really important to keep those 5 things in mind. Cessation, the abuse has got to stop. Restitution, to the extent possible, the situation needs to be restored to the situation that it was prior to the injury having taken place. In the absence of the ability to fully restore it to a situation prior to it taking place, it is to be the result of compensation that goes to the victims. Those compensations need to satisfy the desire of the victims for within the context that they're facing, and helpfully leads toward their rehabilitation. A lot of people in this country have reduced the question of reparations to people who don't deserve it getting a check. And it's like, you know, why does that make any sense? Why are we gonna give them money? Those people weren't ever enslaved, so why are they gonna get a check for it? That's from the outside of people being critical looking out. Other people like, you know, what will happen if people get a check? Like when am I gonna get my check? But I assure you that the idea of getting a check of monetary compensation is a confused idea at best, because it doesn't speak to the nature of reparations, which is around repair of an injury. So one of the things that I wanted to do was to develop a framework. I have done a lot of work in philanthropy. Go figure, I always thought that was funny. I've done work in philanthropy, and working with a major project around Black land I initially developed this when I was working with the Black Land and Liberation Initiative that has now morphed into the Black Land and Power Project. And it was really clear to me that we have to think about collective approaches to reparations. So I developed this, and it says, we as a previously enslaved community have suffered damage as a result of oppressive, exploitative, and extractive system. In that system, the product of our labor was forcefully taken from us and accumulated by others. While this damage began a long time ago, both the damage and the effects of the damage continues to exist to this day in ongoing wealth imbalances leading to more exploitation and social alienation. The harm that was done was a collective harm, which stunted our community's development, and that harm must be collectively addressed to facilitate the full development of community. While we were harmed, others benefited from the accumulating the value that was created by our labor. That value formed the financial basis of the Industrial Revolution and the modern globalized world economy. The beneficiaries of the harm done to our community have a moral responsibility to address that wrong. Apologies are not sufficient. The material benefit and wealth taken from our community must be returned in order to facilitate the full development of our full human potential within our community. While the government has a role to play, we also seek reparations from institutions and individuals who have benefited from this exploitation in the past and who still enjoy those benefits. We currently seek the voluntary return of appropriated wealth. We also seek the fair distribution of all benefits derived from that wealth. We vow to continue to struggle to build the power required to gain the return of that which is not voluntarily returned. So we understand that this is a struggle about power, and it ultimately is to have the power to reclaim the value of one's own production that is important. We recognize that we were not the only ones exploited by that system, and that our political strength is increased by joining with others with other victims of that system in demanding our fair access to stolen wealth. We call for the return of stolen assets to the commons, return these assets to the commons for the use of all. We work to build institutions within our community which will utilize our returned wealth to fully develop and maximize the benefit of our community and others who are also damaged by genocide, slavery, indentured servitude, and imperialism. We also continue to build institutions to fight against the ongoing damage and end the exploitation as we fight for our rightful reparations. So this was a statement that I use as a framework for thinking about what we are doing and need to do. Notice its use of the commons language, the fact that we're talking about returning assets to the commons for the benefit of collectively developing the community. The idea of the individualistic idea of putting assets in the hands of individuals who can then buy stuff with it is something that is an extension of the very system that led to the degradation, the humiliation, the exploitation and extraction that was the slave system. So our view is, again, to return to a commons. One of the institutions that I work with actively is Seed Commons, which is building a financial structure for the purpose of elevating and developing communities as they develop their resources in a non-extractive and a non-exploitative way. And so it is vehicles like Seed Commons that must be created in order to receive resources that need to go back into the commons for the purpose of developing community. So with that, I want to raise the question, and I want all of us to engage in the question for some time, for I guess about the next hour, of is the cooperative movement doing its part? And the reason I want to talk about it is because the cooperative movement has a capacity to be very consistent with the whole notion of reparations, community self-reliance, independence, freedom, and development. But the question is it doing that or is it doing something else? I believe some of us, if we would think about it, would have to admit that the cooperative movement has a number of parts and features. And sometimes we even brag about the cooperative movement as though one of the most important parts of it is how much it's like the rest of capitalism, as opposed to talking about the cooperative movement principally from the standpoint of how in so many ways it is different from capitalism. I want to make it really, really clear that the capitalist system that gave rise to the slave system that then helped to fund and finance the capitalist system is rooted in the singular idea that the most sacred thing that exists is a constant expansion of profit. It is using in the naive words of some people, it's like, you know, you don't want to have to work, you want your money to work for you. You're going to put your money to work. And so it's like this money is going to expand. And I will assure you that there is no magic process by which money just expands on its own. That would kind of violate all of the laws of physics and the universe, and quite frankly, the economic laws, except we're lied to about what the nature of the economic laws are. Money doesn't grow, it doesn't expand by itself. It is human labor and human labor alone that is capable of producing new value. So you take a lump of gold, and a skilled goldsmith can take that lump of gold and produce out of it a beautiful ornament of whether it be jewelry or a chalice to drink from, or even an electronic part that will never corrode because the gold doesn't oxidize. But a goldsmith, labor on that gold increases the value of the gold. Now, there are some people who are really short-sighted who would take gold, I don't care what form it was in, and melt it back down. But what they're doing in the course of doing that is destroying its value. The finished piece is worth more than are the raw materials. Just as the automobiles that we ride around in are worth more than the iron ore and the rubber sap gum and the plastic and the poisonous gases from which it is made. At the point it's able to move us around, The bicycles we have are worth more than the component parts. All of these things are worth more than the component parts because, again, they are the products of that raw material and human labor. So the human labor is producing value all of the time. So that value could be retained in the commons, or under capitalism, that value is appropriated by individuals and small groups working together just for the purpose of expanding that value. And when that happens, everything else is taken to be instrumental to this sacred idea of let's expand capitalist value, let's expand profit. So everything else is used up. So things that are actually sacred, like human life and the capacity of the planet to keep us alive and to house us and keep us safe, all of those things, human relationships, all those things are taken as instrumental, as being less important than the expansion of money. So we use up human beings and human relationships, as did that slave system, in order to do this, to expand this pile of money, which ought to be just a tool. Money doing three things. One, it is a measure of value. It kind of tells us how much human labor goes into something. It is a means of exchange. It helps us engage in trading things. When one thing is produced in one place and something else is desired somewhere else, the money becomes a means of exchange. And it is a means of storage of value. So if you want to do some work now and retain the value of it in order to use that value later in order to do something with it, or you can even store up value so that, for a rainy day. If any of us have been reflecting on the current pandemic that the United States and the world are going through, then you recognize that there is a need for making preparations in advance for periods in which people are not able to go about business as usual and be productive. So in some communities, that used to consist of storing up sufficient amount of grain so that you could withstand a year or two of bad crops from drought or pestilence. Locusts come through and eat everything up, but you had some food stored so people don't starve to death. So there's real utility in having surplus that is produced by human labor, because again, all of us are able to produce more than we use. Enslaved people were able to produce more than they used. It was piled up and owned by the slave master. Part of what they produced went to feeding them. So it's always almost amused me, but that's because I have a sick sense of humor. It's always amused me that there were arguments that were made about slavery. It's like, well, how would the slaves feed themselves if it weren't for them being here on our plantation? It's like, damn, the slaves are feeding you. They built the plantation. They built your house. They feed you every meal you eat. They grow the food. And you wonder how they would feed themselves? They only get a tiny fraction of what they have to produce every day. It's not like you sat around making sure you grew some extra crops because you're getting ready to buy some more slaves and you wanted to feed them. That's such a foolish idea. So you worry about how the slaves can produce, yet the slaves had to produce enough for themselves and for everything else that was developed in the South and much of the rest of the world. And in fact, it was this surplus that was produced that, rather than being stored up in case there was a pandemic, or in case there was a drought, or in case the commodity prices fell, this stuff was being stored up in such a way that individuals benefited from it and the community suffered and continues to suffer. So we have a cooperative movement that we're building. Our cooperative movement is based on some principles that we identify needs, and we come up with structures that are collectively owned and collectively operated that share in the financial benefits of it in a fair kind of way through democratic process. That's what our cooperative movement needs to be, but part of it is very, very closely linked to the existing capitalist system, where some people think that the purpose of their co-op is to make a lot of profit, as opposed to understanding the purpose of your co-op ought to be to meet needs that you have identified in a fair kind of way. And in the course of doing that, it allows us the ability to train ourselves in the governance techniques, train ourselves in the financial record-keeping techniques, train ourselves in all of the other things that we need to know to be able to build community that is not rooted in individualism, that is not rooted in a constant expansion of profit, but rather rooted in meeting human needs. So with that in mind, there were some things I wanted to in particular talk about. One, I want to give a shout out to Jessica Gordon Nimhart, having written the book Collective Courage. So much of that book is about an understanding of the resilience of people who had at one time been enslaved in this country, and even traces part of their history back to before that, and talking about the collective kind of financial institutions and economic institutions that were built so that we don't just narrowly restrict our thinking about the cooperative movement from the thing that came from the Rochdale in England in the middle of the 19th century. For however important that might have been in helping to codify some cooperative principles and allow us to have the kind of cooperative movement with the language that we have, it did not invent those ideas, and those ideas were already deeply rooted in societies and communities. And Jessica Gordon Nimhart's book, Collective Courage, helps to express that in a way that has helped a lot of people understand that and broaden their sense of the possibility of cooperative entities being part of the racial justice movement in this country. But we have other kinds of institutions that are deeply connected with the cooperative movement. And I want people using the chat to write some of their reflections out. If you are taking notes or if you're somewhere where you can, I want you to write down these organizations: Cooperation Works, National Cooperative Business Association, NCBA, FCI, the Food Co-op Initiative, DOWI and the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, ACE, that's the Association of Cooperative Educators, FSC-LAF, the Federation of Southern Cooperative Land Assistance Fund, and Seed Commons. I want us to think about the role that we see those organizations playing, and some kind of way I want us to be able to dig out of the chat room some reflections that people are able to make on the extent that they see some of those organizations either moving us toward the reparations and repair that is a healthy part of how we need to be moving forward toward liberation and building a movement for justice in this country, or the extent to which we think that there are major changes and differences in terms of how those groups operate that would help move them in that direction. I had hoped that we would have this in hand, but I have to rely on, if someone wants me to read that list of organizations off again, I'd be happy to. Is that useful?
Yeah, why don't you read that list out one more time and I'll type it in the chat for you.
That'd be great. Cooperation Works. That's a co-op training center nationally. NCBA. And I think one of its board members, I'm not sure if he's still current, I just saw entering Esteban. FCI, Food Co-op Initiative. DOWI and U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. ACE, the Association of Cooperative Educators. And Federation of Southern Cooperatives / Land Assistance Fund, and Seed Commons, a community wealth cooperative.
Great, and so Ed, I know you want some folks to respond in chat, so I'll open that up for folks in just a minute, but why don't you share out your question one more time for folks as well?
The question is, how do you see those organizations participating in a movement for justice that is rooted in some type of reparations framework, recognizing the benefit that the economy as a whole has gotten from this period of the existence of enslavement, and a sense that we have a responsibility, a moral obligation to repair those atrocities that took place and continue to take place in the society, leading to the differentials that we see today.
Great, so that's a lot to think about. So folks, think about your answer and we'll open up the chat in just a moment. Just in case we do get Zoom bombed, if we start to see any inappropriate content, just so folks know, we'll close the chat right back up again. So I'm gonna open up the chat right now. So as folks are ready, as you're thinking about Ed's question, feel free to respond in the chat and send it out to everyone.
Someone said that's a rich question. It depends on which side some of these organizations you own. It might be a poor question. But I really want us to think about it, because I guess part of the point is that if we don't reflect on how the things we continue to do either add to or take away from systemic racism and oppression in the society, then we will tend, through the inertia of what we're doing, to continue the practices that we engage in. So there's some institutional structures that exist within the cooperative movement. And we have to think about those institutional structures from the standpoint of, have these institutional structures, have they instituted any critical, reflective understanding of the emergence of the world that we see today, or have they indeed continued along the lines of what Henry Clay said, that this stuff is just too deeply embedded? Who would ever think about trying to change that? It would cause disruptions. And there's some people evidently who are so dead set against there being disruptions that they don't recognize the potential role that they have in correcting this. Again, I want to make clear that I don't consider that reparations is simply a question for what will the federal government do or not do. There's a bill, HR 40, that's been introduced repeatedly, and it never seemed to get enough support to get through committee, that basically requests the United States to engage in a serious commission to look at the prospects of doing reparations. I'm recently moved from North Carolina, where in the western part of the state, in Asheville, North Carolina, the local city council has passed a bill saying that the city council of Asheville, North Carolina recognizes the need for reparations. I want us to think about whether or not we feel that the institutions that we are part of, some of which we have helped create within the cooperative movement, are reflecting on the role that cooperatives can play and the responsibility. And I have some very, very specific things to talk about as it relates to what is it that people can do with their individual co-ops, as well as with the cooperative institutions that are being built. I'm not able to keep up with all of the things that people are writing in the chat. Is somebody reading them?
Yeah, we got a lot of options here. A few different things we're seeing, Ed, are, for example, folks, different organizations who have signed on to the Movement for Black Lives platform,
Uh-huh.
specifically raising up the Federation in Dowie specifically, as well as like putting, just reparations on a conference agenda as an example. Let me look for a couple other examples from folks here.
I actually think that's really good because that's not normally what people ask me to talk about at conferences, but I like it because I think we need to. I think we need to think about it in a comprehensive place.
One comment I see here from Terry is saying that it seems to me that most, if not all of these organizations would be open to the consideration of reparations, but that only the Federation of Southern Cooperatives and Land Assistance Fund and possibly Seed Commons have any greater alignment with reparations. Ed, I'm wondering what you think about that.
Seed Commons somewhat explicitly in the course of our work take this up. I mean, as it grew out of the recovered factory movement in South America and came to the United States, it immediately moved in close proximity with the work we were doing in the South of Southern Grassroots Economies Project and working along with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives and its rich history. So we are trying to be explicit about our ability within Seed Commons to utilize a framework that sees part of our work as a repair of the damage caused in communities. Certainly the Federation of Southern Cooperatives as a 50-year-old institution that grew out of the civil rights movement in the South explicitly upholds the need for reparations, again, as a collective process. Recently, it won a major settlement against the U.S. Department of Agriculture, recently in the last 10 years, called the Pickford suit. And one of the leaders in the Federation of Southern Cooperative, the Pickford suit ended up with some rewards of, I think, $50,000 going, in case you didn't have complete documentation, going to some farmers for having been explicitly discriminated against. This is one of the kind of challenges of this whole question of compensation, when some people got some checks and the $50,000 is nowhere near enough. And one of the leaders in the Federation, Ben Burkett, that some of you all may know or know of, once said that he really wishes people had left the money pooled together as a development fund rather than dividing it up and paying out individual people for it. Because quite frankly, one of the things we know about the cooperative movement is that by us aggregating our capacities, we're able to do more together than we would do individually. Similarly, if you take a pile of money and you spread it out among a bunch of people, at some point it goes from being a potential opportunity for development into an additional opportunity for consumption. And that consumption, rather than being a productive activity, ends up just basically putting us into the same grips of the economy, this current capitalist economy, where ultimately the capitalists are the ones who benefit from the purchase we make throughout their system. And so this is one of the kind of contradictions that happen. So certainly those two organizations have explicit kind of concerns for it. But I would wonder about, I mean, I have been in ACE conferences, and I don't know if there are any people here who are active with the Association for Cooperative Educators. But I remember, hearing things like, well, this whole urge toward cooperativism is just about dead. And we just don't have that many cooperatives. And I'm going, well, you haven't been in some of the communities I've been working in the South, where as soon as people hear this as a possibility, they want to talk about how do we do it. So one of the things I think is that we can downplay the likelihood of it. If we just simply want cooperatives to be the next capitalist structure, then we would approach it in one way. If we want cooperatives to be something different, that don't take the profit motive as the key thing, that don't even necessarily, that take meeting needs, don't even necessarily take making a lot of money. Most of us have conflated in our head the idea that money is how you get the stuff you need. And sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, because we also engage in a lot of things where we directly produce without monetizing them, some of the things we need. So certainly our cultural life isn't always mitigated by money, even though with the existence of, commercial entertainment, much of it is shifting in that direction. But we used to do things that we actually enjoyed doing. We used to grow the food that we enjoyed eating. So it is meeting needs and elevating the quality of life that needs to be central. So I would be happier personally, and again, I'm not in charge of all the co-ops we develop. I would be happier in general if people, rather than asking how can we make a lot of money, ask what are some of the things that we need that we can do for ourselves. And in the course of us doing these things for ourselves and building the kind of world that we want to see, we will find things that we are able to do and trade for other things that other people are able to do. The self-reliant communities that we have to build can't just simply be mitigated by having a pile of money. I've even heard people talk about, well, let's find a way to grow something so we can export it to Africa. I'm going, the soil in Africa is fertile. So I'm sure that the people in Africa can grow a lot of the foods that they need themselves. That sounds like a terrible idea. But if indeed you're thinking about, how to expand a pile of money, then that is the thinking that you stay in. If indeed you're thinking about how you meet needs, elevate the quality of life, then that is what will grow from a reparations framework, just like those ministers were saying, that we want us to be in a situation where the product of our labor is not taken off somewhere else. And I would hope we also want to be in a position where we're not taking the product of somebody else's labor, that we are trying to figure out all of the ways that we can build healthy communities that are rooted in their capacity to identify democratically and collectively engage in activity to meet their needs. And as they do so, that the surplus that's produced, one, prepares us for a rainy day or maybe a pandemic, and at the same time allows us in between to be elevating the quality of life and setting new and higher community standards that meet our needs within community. But it's so hard for me not to be able to hear from people talking back at me.
Ed, I'm wondering, Jessica is actually here right now and said that if it would be helpful, she'd be more than happy to jump into conversation with you about some of this. Would you be interested in that?
I would absolutely love it. Jessica, please.
All right, give me 1 second so I can get Jessica set up for this. We got a star guest appearance. This is a big deal.
Yeah.
All right, give me 1 second.
No, you got to ask her first. Is she okay with what I'm talking about? If she's not, I don't want to interfere with me.
I asked her. She said she'd be down. She said she'd be okay.
Okay.
So, Jessica, I'm going to make you a co-host right now, and you are welcome to turn on your video and your mic if you'd like.
I don't have the best background, but I do have my little Black Lives Matter that back there with the Care Bears holding up their Black Lives Matter sign.
They're doing great. How you doing? It's so
I'm
good
okay.
to see you.
Yeah, it's great. I really didn't want to hijack your stuff, but
No. I need some hijacking at this point because I'm just starting to ramble on and on, saying the same thing over and over again. So what is your reflection on what we've been talking about so far?
So I was mentioning that I have actually an article about reparations where I suggest that we need to add a case for reparations from the sabotage against Black co-ops, the history of sabotage against Black co-ops, that's an additional reason why we need reparations.
Absolutely.
And that one of the solutions, like what Ben Burkett says, is to use pooled money to do co-op education, non-exploitative loans, to people of color communities to do worker co-ops and other co-op development. And that, it doesn't all need to be thought about as individual disbursements, but we need to think about, what to do with the group money and how to create those co-op ecologies also, as you said, so that the money doesn't just go back into the capitalist system, We need to keep the money recirculating, So we need money so that we understand how to do this work, and then money to get our businesses and enterprises going, so then the money recirculates among us and doesn't go back out to the same exploitative system that started it.
I absolutely agree. Um, One of the things I'd like to hear your reflection on, I had some notes that I prepared for this about some of the things that individuals could be doing within their cooperative structures. And so there are like 4 points here that are rooted in this thing about relationships, that while relationships are important, I think that we have to be concerned about who is it that we are bringing along in our work. So I want people to ask themselves, is your work with the usual suspects, which are the folks you already know and the people that you're already comfortable with, or do you reach outside of that? I want people to think about, is there an intentional plan to get out of your comfort zone to work with groups you traditionally have not known and have not worked with? I want people to think about, are you putting resources back into the areas from which they have been extracted? And finally, I want people to think about, are you intentionally helping to create opportunities to collectively create and retain wealth in marginalized communities? I think that those 4 things, which again are in the notes that will be available after this, are some of the things that people can look at, think about, and I would imagine need to develop some plans for.
I agree with you. In fact, I'm going to steal some of those questions because I happen to be one of the keynotes next month at the NCBA Co-op Impact Conference, right? Which is focusing on, what are they calling it? Diversity, equity, and inclusion or something. And I promised them that I was going to try to make people uncomfortable by talking about what it really takes to promote racial justice, even in the co-op movement, when co-op people already think they're so progressive and liberal already. And so I think those kinds of questions, I'm going to probably add them to my talk.
You're absolutely welcome to them.
I was also going to talk about microaggressions and, things that happen in co-ops that you don't even think of as being racist or having to do with institutional racism. But I think also that issue about where the resources actually being put is really important. And how are you diverting those resources in a way that would actually really make a difference for the people who have been so marginalized and exploited all these years, even by our own co-op systems. And even the role that co-ops play in gentrification, right, in urban settings, we have to address that issue also in the co-op movement.
Absolutely. One of the things I wanted to spend a little time talking about, and again, Jessica, I would love your reflection on these things too, are some new initiatives that y'all have to excuse me, I need a drink. But anyway, I'm just joking. Some new initiatives that are developing along the lines of cooperative ownership within some communities. One of the things that I think is underdeveloped within the cooperative movement are serious approaches toward broad community ownership of assets. And the reason I'm saying that is because it appears to me that that the gentrification problem that we see nationally is a reflection of what happens in late stage capitalism when this concentrated ownership begins to engage in speculative ownership around land that ultimately leads toward elevating the cost of land in such a way as to price people out of communities and push people further into the margins. There are a couple of initiatives around that I think are noteworthy, that we should look at what it means and how to extend them. One is in Western North Carolina with Emma Poder. Emma Poder is a community near Asheville, North Carolina, that has for years been doing kind of defensive work around immigration issues. But in the course of that has done a level of organizing and work with people and maintaining some of their indigenous organizing structures from people, many of the people have been Mexican immigrants, like savings clubs that have allowed them to to build up a substantial core of organized people in the community that are interested in cooperatives. So recently, they have support of Seed Commons. They've bought a couple of trailer parks. Many of their members live in trailer parks, and the trailer parks are becoming gentrified because that land, quote, highest and best use of that land is to build resort areas and condominiums and bed and breakfast units in this rapidly gentrifying area. So what they have done is identify some trailer parks that were for sale and found ways to collectively buy them and create democratic collective structures for ownership that will do them as basically cooperative structures. But growing out of two of those that have somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 residences for people that they've developed, they've also bought a commercial structure which is useful as an organizational meeting place. And this commercial structure was bought by 31 families putting up $1,000 each as a down payment. They were able to get private financing for the other $150,000 of $185,000 or so purchase price. Then they were able to come to Seed Commons and get a loan for about $75,000 for the upfit of part of the building. And the 1,000 families that have bought into this will be able to, and I don't know that they have chosen to do this yet, they're probably still talking about, they will be able to pay themselves a dividend on the $1,000 each that they put in, while they are seeking an additional 150 families to put up another $1,000 each to pay off the balance of the mortgage. Now, when you talk about 180 families owning a building, that's an entirely different model from the gentrification model that has one person owning the building and trying to figure out a way to jack up the rent every year, and then selling it speculative to another owner who's going to repair it and jack it up even more. So now the community owns it, has every bit of an interest in maintaining the quality of it and continuing to upfit it, but all of the benefits from that are going back into community. So that's one example of it. There's a process that's going on in Los Angeles right now. I don't know how many people know about it, where there's an effort underway to buy the Crenshaw Mall, which is 40 acres of land in downtown LA. That is, again, in a rapidly gentrifying area. LA is trying to approach what San Francisco and Seattle and Boston have done in becoming virtually unlivable for the kind of moderate or low income people that once populated those areas. And this area in Crenshaw over near Leimert Park has a very historic significance, and it will end up costing $100 million to buy, but there's a really ambitious crew of people that has consultants that are working with it in figuring out how to purchase this, again, as a community-owned asset, where community members will be the ones to get the benefit from it. There's a legal structure called a REIT, Real Estate Investment Trust, which is one of the legal structures that is speculative on the one hand, but is also lucrative on the other. That a number of high dollar financial structures end up using it, and it's not very easily available through cooperative entities. But that's, again, one of the kinds of things that the cooperative movement needs to work on, which is figuring out how we can have co-op ownership of our inner city areas and do it in a way that rationally meets the needs of communities. And right now I've moved to Mississippi, and I've organized a group called the Delta Commons Group that is looking to gain access of a local Jim Crow hospital that at one time was a hospital that they would not let Bessie Smith be treated in when she died of an automobile accident. And we want to convert that hospital into, again, a mixed use residential and an institutional site, complete with recreation and art, so that it transforms this neighborhood that has gone from being an exclusive white neighborhood to being a mixed-use, overwhelmingly Black neighborhood now. So white folk have run. There's some wealthy white people who've run out of the community, so that Clarksville, Mississippi is 80% Black at this point. And they've gone to Snob Hill and Moon Lake, but that's okay, because we can build and develop our community to do things that meet our needs and provide for quality housing, again, under community ownership. And these are some of the kinds of efforts that I think are also being developed. Did you know about some of those? I know you know about some of them, Jessica.
Yes, I know about all of them. You know, Clark has been sending notes about the Crenshaw thing. He seems very optimistic that it's going to happen. Clark
Clark and I
Arrington
on the phone
at
3
Working
hours.
World.
We're on the phone 3 hours almost every day. He's got me working on that project with him. So
So it's,
I
and
hope it
I do
works.
think, yeah, I think those kinds of projects are the kind of imagination and energy that we need to think about how to turn some of these things around, right? Because I think, again, if we're talking about urban, right, gentrification is just killing us.
Exactly.
And right, and then what are we going to do with all the displaced people, right? There's no plan, there's no anything for them. You know, the suburbs aren't a place for them. There's nothing, right?
Yeah.
And it's just going to reproduce all the, you know, all the issues that we've been dealing with for centuries already. So we need out of the box thinking. The co-op world, the worker co-op world in particular, right? We need to be ahead of the curve on this. And I do think, you know, we haven't talked about it, but there are some sectors of the co-op world that should be able to help fund this stuff, right? The rural electrics, at least they used to. I just heard they're about to lose a bunch of money because of COVID, but they used to have extra money. The ag sectors, the co-op ag sector has money. So that's the other thing I do think we need, you know, we need the co-op world to pay up a little bit.
Yes, I fully agree. And the last thing I wanted to say before I open up for questions and answers, and if you will, Jessica, I'd love for you to stay here and help answer questions. We can have another 20 minutes of question and answers. But it's in terms of how we approach our work. I think we approach our work by fighting against stuff that's bad, by building the new things that we need, by disputing assumed knowledge. Those are the old narratives of domination, by creating new humane narratives of freedom and liberation, by rediscovering and respecting traditional wisdom, by scientifically creating new analyses of our current realities, by boldly creating new forms and having the confidence in and expanding our capacity. Those to me are broad general approaches to our work. Again, when the notes from this go out, I would hope that this is available to people to think about and utilize in the course of your own work. But in the meantime, I'd love to take questions for Jessica and I.
Yeah, while we're gathering some, one that came up as you all and Jessica, I just want to say thanks again for jumping in. I really appreciate this guest star appearance. This is a powerhouse thing right here. But one question that Tayari raised in the chat was essentially, why can't funding go to both individuals and to commons jointly? And specifically raised up, right, that there are Black folks, there are families who are really struggling right now, right, that struggle is real. And I think we could even open that up to think about Black-owned businesses as well. There are Black-owned businesses that are struggling. There are Black-owned co-ops that are struggling. And so I'm wondering, what do both of you think about finding that balance between putting the money towards a commons versus also, right, that emergency relief work that is, I mean, very necessary now in this moment, but has been necessary for a while?
Well, I want to make it clear that I don't oppose emergency relief work. I think the people who have emergencies and need help, they need help. I think that we ought to be constructing inside community opportunities to make sure that people have all of the things that they need. I'm concerned about non-means tested distributions of large amounts of money that people are only able to spend in the existing system because there's not been any other system created. And again, to me, that goes for everything from universal basic income. There's no system in which that money would get spent other than the existing system, which would make it's useful for stabilizing the existing system. As an emergency measure, I'm absolutely for it because again, it makes sense as an emergency measure. That's what the stimulus stuff was, even though obviously they cheated and made more of it available for their corporate cronies than they did for the people who most need help. But had you not cheated and been able to pass out money that everybody could use, even that would have made some sense. But that's an emergency measure. The real question we have is also the question of what kind of world do we want to build and what does it take to build that world? And I'm saying in that context, individual distributions don't actually help a lot toward that. They're absolutely useful from the standpoint people need something, they need it, they're hungry, they need some food. If the only place they can get food is buying at a grocery store, they need some money to buy some food. So I'm not questioning that, and absolutely it's possible. But I'm just saying that until we build a new structure in which to spend the money, then what we're left with is the likelihood that the monies and stuff we spent will go into the existing system and strengthen it. So that's my reflection on it. And again, I'm not in charge of any distribution or reparations or anything else. So all I get a chance to do is say what I think. Jessica, would you chime in on that one?
I don't really have, I mean, I basically agree with you. I agree we need some mechanism for emergency dispersals, right? If we want to call that a reparations disbursement, we can, but we should be doing that as human beings. For me, I feel like reparations, you know, in the same way that Ed was talking about, to me, reparations should really be a very strategic use of funds that can make a difference, can help transition us to a new world, to take us out of the system that reparations is supposed to be repairing, right? We're not repairing it if the reparations can't go to get us out of the same cycle. So I definitely agree that, you know, in these times, in any period of time, we have to help people who are starving and dying and sick and whatever. But that, to me, that's what we do as a humane society. And that's part of what we should be doing as people who care about being in a humane society. We should be working on that sort of, what do you do in an emergency? But for me, the reparations issue is more about how to make sure those funds are used in a way that repairs the harm so it can't happen again, or it can't keep happening. We've got to use reparations to break the cycle and to usher us into a new world, a new era, and that's what we really need the money for. But as I said, I wouldn't fight somebody if they, you know, if the argument was some of the reparations money should go immediately to, you know, making sure people stop dying and people can feed their children. But I think in terms of the strategy, we've got to think about the strategy differently. And the other point about reparations is it's supposed to be controlled by the people who were harmed. And right now, that even that isn't on the table yet, right? It's still about the people who got the money deciding, okay, we'll give it to you, and sometimes trying to tell us what to do with it. So somehow we need to establish new principles, right? So it's got to be controlled by the people who were harmed. It's got to be used to help stop that systemic harm from continuing. It's got to be used to help us usher into a new world, that kind of thing. And so that's how I would like us to think about it. But I agree, we can't forget about the people who are really struggling right now.
One of the things I want to say is I think part of the limit of our imagination when we think about, well, I want to get some money, is that we don't really think much about what are the opportunities for development that would be if there was actually a pool of money available to help folk who want to be productive produce the things for the community that it needs. We have lost track of our connection to productivity and production, so that a lot of us are only able to think of it in terms of consumption. And so it's like, well, how am I going to get something to buy something with? But without raising the question of who you buying it from, how to get there, who in the world produced it, and what is happening to our capacity to produce the things for ourselves that we need to meet our needs. And I'm not talking about needs going unmet. Obviously, if some needs are going unmet, then people should do something to meet those needs. But I'm talking about our ability to meet those needs and us regaining the imagination that we have the capacity to do that. And we have to be boldly creative around thinking about that capacity and what would be required. So the real question to me, when people are worrying about folks who don't have their needs met, is what do we want to do as a community to help make sure those needs get met? Do we just want to give them some money so they can go out into an oppressive system and buy something and strengthen that oppressive system? Or do we want to find some ways to make sure those needs are being met, that people have enough to eat, that they have childcare, that they have opportunities to be productive and participate in the society, that they have cultural opportunities to produce the great art that can be produced, not necessarily for the standpoint of how much money you can make of it, but because it makes us more human. It makes us happier to be able to produce the poetry, the paintings, the sculpture, the music that we're capable of doing. What does it take for us to make sure that we have a community that is fully productive and able to do what it needs to do for itself, so that all the people who are in its suffering don't have to find a way to get to the oppressive society that made them suffer? That's like saying to somebody who is enslaved, look, you just need to find a way to get back on that plantation, because quite frankly, it's hard out here. Yeah, it's hard out here, but ultimately we're gonna have to build something where it's hard, or we will always be on that plantation where we not only we built the plantation. So, I mean, we're gonna have to build something. We're gonna build up an oppressive system, or we're gonna build something for ourselves.
Thank you two so much for that. I want to call in Olga, who's our moderator, who collected another question for the two of you.
Yes, so the question is, how are cooperatives working with unions to work against forces that are deliberately weakening our democracy in all senses?
And so I think we can also expand this too to think about, like, how do we see the relationship between unions and co-ops as part of the reparations movement as well, and what actual actions do we want to see from them?
I'm going to start, and then Jessica add on to this. Unions are capable of long-term and short-term thinking. That's something that's really, really important, because if you look objectively, I've been a union organizer and a union activist most of my life. My daddy was a union organizer and an activist. Told me, he says, son, if you're ever in a position to either be in a union or not, get in it. It's always better. So I have a predisposition and prejudice toward unions. On the other hand, I also read a lot of history and realized that the actual role of the union movement in this country has swung at different points depending on whether it's under progressive leadership or reactionary leadership. And so you cannot elevate union, just the fact that it's a union, to me is like just the fact somebody's Black. It doesn't necessarily mean that what they're saying on a given day makes any sense. So I believe that the weakening of the union movement in this country has damaged some of the progressive things that took place. But I also know that it was not all that far back in history that that some aspects of the union movement stood for and fought for really, really kind of backward exclusionary activities that excluded some people from it. And again, there's a really, really useful chapter in W.B. Du Bois' book, Black Reconstruction, that talks about white labor, that is fascinating from the standpoint of kind of an impassioned, objective look at the progressive and really reactionary roles that were played at different parts. But in spite of any and all of that, I'm absolutely in favor of unions being more closely connected with the cooperative movement and working people being that. Again, part of what I'm saying, I'm thinking about the role that some construction trade unions and stuff play with as it relates to the ecological movement in this country. In terms of this, again, short-term thinking. It's like, is not building this nuclear plant going to cut into my job, or is not building this oil pipeline going to cut into my job right now, short-term, as opposed to the kind of longer-term thinking about, what do these things mean for community broadly? So I actually want us to influence the cooperative movement so that it takes a more consistent and conscious and explicitly political liberatory stand. I also want us to influence the union movement that way. I want to build close relationships between what's left of we should talk about the union movement in terms of what's left of the union movement, in terms of what's left of the union movement being strengthened by the cooperative movement in the name of working people, not in the name of narrowness, not in the name of kind of narrow protection of your craft to the expense of the community of people around it and the planet. And so those are the things I just think we have to to honestly think of as we're talking about building that connection. I know there's a union co-op movement that's done a lot of work in the Cincinnati area. There are a lot of people who develop relationships with Mondragon and the One Worker, One Vote, aspects of that. And so there are people who are actively working on kind of union co-op relationships and trying to get unions to be supportive, as they're fighting for their lives. That part of how they might fight for their lives is to support and engage in worker co-op development activity. That's what little I know about it. Jessica?
Yeah, well, I mean, Ed and I have similar views on a lot of this stuff. So what Ed said, and I'll just add a couple things. That complicated history between unions and Black folks and unions and co-ops is really fascinating. I get excited about what was happening in the 1880s, which is actually a similar period till now, politically, and I guess economically. And that was actually an exciting time for unions, co-ops, the populist movement, and Black progressivism. And what was happening there was the unions were actually they were supporter of gender equity and women's rights. They were supporters of integration, not segregated labor. They were supporters of labor owning their own businesses, worker co-ops, and promoting worker co-ops. The coalition in Richmond in 1886 is really fascinating, right? The Working Men's Party that won the majority of the seats in the city council deliberately on a platform because they wanted to be in charge of rebuilding this Richmond City Hall without using slave labor and using women's labor, integrated labor, and worker co-ops. And so they actually won the majority of the city council and were able to build Richmond City Hall in the way they wanted to. So those kinds of coalitions really excite me. We don't have as many of those in the 20th and the 21st century, but I think it's a good model for how you can think of kind of connecting, right, all the issues and how all the issues can be well connected. Someone just sent me a private message about, where does the 13th Amendment and incarcerated people and prison abolition fit into this? Well, that example actually, right, helps with that too, because it was anti-slave labor, and slave labor at that time was incarcerated labor, right? And incarcerated people are still doing slave labor. And I've also been doing some research on worker co-ops in prisons and how we can do that in the US. So I think we can think about these issues about labor, right? Dignity of labor, workers' rights, right? How they connect with gender equity, racial equity, and transforming our society, to think of them as all working together. But right now, I think we have a lot of work to do with the unions. Some of them are sort of interested in co-ops. Some, like I guess the Wobblies, have always been supportive of co-ops. US Steel is doing the Mondragon project, so they have some interest in co-ops, but I'm not sure they're willing to totally transform to a worker co-op model. But I do think that's, again, where, right, finding who the allies are, where is the match, right? Because allies don't always agree on everything. So figure out who are the unions that are allies, where's the match in that, and then how do we bring them even further? How do we make them even more radical? Because right now in capitalism, you still, labor power through radical unions is still important. And then we've seen actually in the worker co-op movement that even with worker co-ops, having unions can be extremely important and extremely helpful as part of the strategy to empower labor even within their own worker co-ops. So I think we've got synergies there. Again, it's one of those, I keep talking about being strategic. I don't know how else to talk about these topics without talking about how deliberate and strategic we have to be about who to bring to the table, what issues to bring, and how to make sure we don't keep getting co-opted.
Getting co-opted? We're co-ops. We should be co-opted.
That's right.
Anyway.
Ed and Jessica, we are just at our time. Jessica, thank you so much again for jumping in sort of by surprise, but really you contributed so much to this. And Ed, thank you so much for this session.
My pleasure. My pleasure. This organization has a special place in my heart.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for saving me.
Yeah, I just want to pass it over now to Zen, to give us a few closing announcements before we finish out.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Jessica. Fantastic conversation. Just a couple things I posted in the chat. So a reminder to please complete our conference evaluation and let us know what you thought. I think that those evaluations really help us, and it, allows us to develop better programming down the line. And then finally, we're going to do some brief closing announcements at the Zoom link that I also included in the chat. And then we'll have a DJ who's just going to be playing some music for us as we enter the weekend. So it's been a heavy week. It's been a heavy month, heavy year. And we had some really important conversations. I think we could all use a little bit of dancing. So if you're interested in that, check out that link. We'll close up the conference and move right into the evening. So yeah, I think those are my announcements. And again, thank you, Ed, and thank you, Jessica, for the conversation today.
Thank you. Bye now.
Have a good evening, everyone. We'll see you at the closing.